It was made very, very clear that all of the attractions there were not for us. That was for, underprivileged children and children that were terminally ill that couldn't go to Disneyland.
For 30 years, the whole world thought it knew exactly what life was like behind the gates of Neverland Ranch. A private Ferris wheel spinning in the California sun. A zoo full of exotic animals just steps from the front door. A train circling the property like something out of a storybook. That was the picture everyone had in their heads. But according to the woman who actually lived it, almost none of that picture is true. And the real story she just told the world is stranger, sadder, and honestly more human than anything the tabloids ever printed. Neverland Ranch was never just a house. It was a 2,700-acre property in Santa Barbara County that Michael Jackson bought years before his daughter Paris was even born, and he turned it into something closer to a private theme park than a family home. There was a working carnival with rides, a movie theater with dozens of seats, a menagerie of animals, and a functioning railway complete with its own station. He named it after the fictional island in Peter Pan, the place where children never grow old, and for decades that name alone did most of the storytelling for him. Magazines ran photo spreads. Documentaries speculated. Late-night hosts made jokes about the kid with a private zoo in his backyard. And through all of it, nobody ever really asked the 3 children who grew up there what any of it actually felt like from the inside. That silence is finally starting to break. Paris Jackson, now in her late 20s, sat down for a long, unusually open conversation on one of the biggest podcasts in the world, and what she described was almost the opposite of the fantasy everyone assumed. She wasn't defensive about it. She wasn't trying to spin anything. She just laid out what her actual childhood looked like, and it turns out the truth had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for someone to finally ask. It's worth thinking about how rare that kind of moment actually is. Children of extremely famous parents almost never get to correct the record on their own terms. Usually the narrative gets built by other people first, by photographers who caught a glimpse of a gate from the road, by biographers piecing together second-hand accounts, by entertainment segments that had a few hours of access and turned it into a definitive portrait. By the time the child grows up enough to speak for themselves, the story has already calcified into something that feels like established fact, even when nobody who actually lived it ever confirmed a single detail. That's essentially what happened with Neverland. The myth got built, repeated, and cemented long before anyone thought to ask Paris, Prince, or BG what any of it actually felt like from the inside looking out. The first thing Paris cleared up is something most people simply got wrong from the start. She didn't spend her whole childhood living at Neverland. Her time actually residing on the property was limited to only the earliest years of her life, not the sprawling, decade-long fantasy that's been repeated in article after article. The family moved around more than people realize, and the idea that she spent her formative years permanently stationed inside a private amusement park simply doesn't match her own memory of how things went. And what filled her days when she was there wasn't roller coasters and giraffes. It was routine. She described mornings that looked almost aggressively normal for a kid whose home happened to have a zoo attached to it. Wake up. Walk to a room set up as a classroom. Sit through lessons because she and her brothers were homeschooled rather than driven off to a regular school building. Then chores. Then homework. Then rules, the kind every kid everywhere has heard a version of at some point in their life. It's a far cry from the version of the story where 3 children spent their afternoons riding a Ferris wheel because they were bored. Paris's own account replaces that image with something almost painfully ordinary. A curriculum, a schedule, and a set of expectations that any homeschooled kid from any background might recognize instantly. So if the rides and the animals weren't some daily perk the Jackson kids got to enjoy whenever they felt like it, then who were they actually for? This is where the story takes its sharpest turn, and honestly, it's the part that reframes everything else. According to Paris, access to those attractions was never a birthright. It was something you had to earn, and even then it wasn't guaranteed. If she and her brothers did their chores, finished their schoolwork, and behaved the way they were supposed to, then maybe, on a weekend, they'd get to see some of the animals, ride something, or catch a movie in the private theater. Maybe. Not automatically. Not as some standing daily privilege. It functioned more like negotiating for dessert or screen time than anything resembling the unlimited playground people assumed existed. And when the reward did come, it wasn't always some over-the-top, only in Neverland kind of experience either. Paris has talked about being taken to places like Chuck E. Cheese and Circus Circus as a treat for finishing her chores, the exact kind of outing countless ordinary families use to motivate their kids on a random Saturday afternoon. Sit with that for a second. A child with a private amusement park a short walk from her bedroom, and her reward for good behavior was a trip to a pizza arcade like any other kid in the country. It's such a small, ordinary detail that it almost sounds made up, except it's coming directly from the person who actually lived through it, not from some tabloid trying to sell a headline. But the piece of the story that really flips the whole narrative on its head is what Paris said the ranch's attractions were actually built for in the first place. By her account, those rides, that zoo, that movie theater weren't primarily there to entertain her or her brothers at all. They existed largely for underprivileged children and kids who were seriously ill, kids who otherwise might never get anything close to a day at an amusement park. Her father reportedly organized regular visits so that sick and disadvantaged children could come spend a day enjoying the property, which turns Neverland into something closer to a charitable retreat than a personal playground built around his own kids. That's an almost complete inversion of the story that's been repeated for 3 decades. Instead of a private carnival that existed to entertain 3 incredibly privileged children, what Paris describes sounds more like a foundation with a family quietly living on the same grounds, a property whose real purpose, according to the person who was actually there, leaned far more toward generosity for children the world tends to overlook than toward spoiling the family that owned it. There's something almost uncomfortable about how completely that reframes the public's decades-long fascination with the place. For years, Neverland was used as a kind of cultural punchline, shorthand for a wealthy man's eccentricity, a symbol trotted out whenever someone wanted to make a joke about excess or isolation. Almost none of that commentary ever paused to consider that the rides and animals people found so easy to mock might have spent far more hours entertaining sick kids and children from struggling families than they ever spent entertaining the family that actually lived on the property. It's a detail that doesn't erase anything else about the more complicated parts of that era, but it does complicate the tidy, cartoonish version of the story that so many people grew up accepting without question. It's a strange thing to think about, that outsiders may have gotten a more generous window into Neverland than most of the Jackson children's own friends ever did. A well-known entertainment program was invited to film an on-camera tour of the estate in the early 2000s, just months before everything about that property and that family changed forever. So while the public spent years assuming Paris and her brothers had free run of a private carnival, camera crews were literally walking those same grounds, filming a place that, according to Paris, functioned more like a rotating charitable destination than a family's personal playground. The rides she rarely got to enjoy were, by her own telling, sometimes more accessible to a group of visiting kids on a press tour than they were to her on an average weekday. Then came the moment that changed everything, not just for Neverland but for the entire Jackson family. In the same year that camera crew walked through those gates for a friendly tour, investigators raided the property as part of a criminal investigation, and Michael Jackson was charged with child molestation. It became one of the most closely watched trials in modern celebrity history, a case that put both the man and the home he built under a level of scrutiny neither had ever faced before. 2 years later he was acquitted on every count. But he never really returned to live at Neverland the way he once had. After the trial, he mostly stepped away from the property, and the estate that had once buzzed with private carnival rides and organized charity visits slowly went quiet, its gates closing on a chapter of the family's history that had, in some ways, already been fading well before most people realized it. By 2020, an investor purchased the property for a fraction of what it was originally listed at, gave it a new name, and shut its gates to the public permanently. The animals, the rides, and the train had already been removed years before the sale ever went through. The fantasy land that shaped so much of the public's idea of the Jackson family simply stopped existing. It's worth pausing on how quickly that happened. A property that once needed its own train station to move people around now sits behind gates that don't open for anyone, its rides long gone, its name erased from most public records. For a family whose childhood was already misunderstood from the outside, watching the physical backdrop of that childhood disappear entirely adds one more strange layer to a story that was never as simple as it looked in magazines. Long before this recent interview, Paris had already been thrust into a spotlight most adults would struggle to handle, let alone an 11-year-old. When her father passed away in the summer of 2009, Paris stood up at his memorial service the following month and spoke to a global audience, a moment that remains one of the most emotional pieces of footage connected to her family to this day. She's since said that moment wasn't planned. It just happened, unfolding on stage before she or anyone around her had time to really process what was going on. She's admitted that even now, she still hasn't gone back to watch that footage of herself. She's described it as feeling like it happened in slow motion in the moment, but that someone needed to say something, and since neither of her brothers stepped forward, she did. That single moment, an 11-year-old finding words for the entire world while grieving her father in real time, says almost as much about who she is as anything that happened behind Neverland's gates. It's the kind of memory most people spend years processing quietly and privately, and she did it in front of millions before she'd even finished elementary school. So after carrying that kind of weight since childhood, how does she actually talk about her relationship with her father today? Despite everything the public has debated about Michael Jackson for decades, Paris's own words about him remain warm and honestly pretty simple. When asked how she'd describe him, she didn't hesitate. She called him funny and said he was her best friend. She's also been honest that it's taken her a long time to get to a place where she can talk about him and their relationship comfortably, which is its own quiet admission that none of this has been easy or quick for her to process. She's made it clear that she and her siblings honor his memory in their own way, and that she doesn't necessarily expect everyone else to understand exactly how they choose to remember him. When asked what she wants people to take away from her father's story, her answer was short: love and light. Not a defense. Not a denial. Just the framing she's chosen to carry with her years after his death. That kind of restraint says a lot, especially considering the platform she had to work with. She could have used that conversation to push back point by point against every headline ever written about her father. Instead, she offered something quieter and in its own way more powerful: a daughter's memory without trying to convince anyone of anything. Neverland wasn't the only thing she opened up about either. During that same conversation, she talked about getting sober a few years back, something she's described as one of the biggest turning points of her adult life. She also spoke about the end of an engagement, giving listeners a rare, honest look at how she's approached relationships and self-love since then. She used the moment to look forward as much as she looked back, mentioning new music on the way, along with lighter topics like astrology and what she calls her own period of major life transition. It's a full, layered conversation: grief sitting next to gratitude, discipline sitting next to reward, an old chapter closing while a new one visibly opens, all coming from someone who spent the earliest years of her life behind the gates of one of the most talked-about properties in celebrity history. What comes through clearly in all of it is that Paris isn't interested in being frozen in everyone's memory as the little girl who once lived at Neverland. She's actively building something new, centered on sobriety, music, and self-reflection, even while she remains willing to revisit the one chapter people can't stop asking her about. That balance, honoring where she came from without being defined by it, might be the real story hiding underneath all the Neverland talk. So what's actually left of that property today, more than 3 decades after it was first built? Not much physically. The estate that once held a zoo, an amusement park, and a 50-seat theater is unrecognizable now. Renamed after its most recent sale, it's been stripped of nearly every trace of the fantasy world it used to represent. No rides. No animals. No public tours. Just quiet, private land, where a very public childhood once unfolded behind locked gates that the world spent 30 years imagining completely wrong. For Paris, going back into that chapter of her life on a podcast watched by millions wasn't really about nostalgia. It was about correcting a version of the story that's been repeated as fact for 3 decades, the idea that she lived inside a permanent amusement park built just for her, free to ride and roam whenever she felt like it. The truth, by her own account, was more disciplined, more ordinary, and in some ways more generous than anyone ever gave that property credit for. Whether this changes how people remember Michael Jackson's most famous piece of land, or just adds one more layer to a legacy that's still endlessly debated, is really up to whoever hears it now. What does feel clear is that Paris Jackson chose to tell this version of her story on her own terms, decades after she had any control over how the world first told it for her. As a kid, she had no say in the headlines written about her family, no say in how Neverland got portrayed, no say in how a criminal trial reshaped public perception of the only home she'd really known. As an adult, sitting across from an interviewer with one of the biggest audiences in podcasting, she finally got to narrate her own memories in her own words, without a tabloid filling in the blanks for her. That shift, from being the subject of a story to being the one telling it, might be the most important thing to take from all of this, more than the details about chores or arcade trips. It's a reminder that the people we spent decades reading about in headlines were, and still are, real kids who grew into adults with their own perspective on the childhoods everyone else thought they understood so well. It also raises a bigger question that goes beyond just one family or one famous property. How many other stories that we've all accepted as common knowledge are actually built on assumption stacked on top of assumption, repeated so many times by so many different outlets that nobody ever stopped to check whether the original premise was true in the first place? Neverland became shorthand for a certain kind of childhood fantasy because it was an easy, visual, almost cinematic idea to sell. A private train. A Ferris wheel. A backyard zoo. It photographed well and it made for an easy headline, and somewhere along the way, the actual children behind that headline became almost secondary to the myth itself. Paris spending an hour candidly walking through what her days were really like doesn't just correct one property's reputation. It's a reminder of how quickly a compelling image can replace an actual human account, and how long that replacement can sit unchallenged if nobody with first-hand knowledge ever speaks up. So now that you've heard it in her own words, does Neverland still feel like the fantasy the tabloids sold us for 30 years, or has this changed the picture for you? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if this gave you a new way of looking at a story you thought you already knew, stick around because there are a lot more of these hiding in plain sight.